Well, hello and welcome to another video by Financial Learning. On today's video, we're going to take a look at the Bitcoin mining stocks for the week of August 15th. We're going to compare the overall sector on things such as short score rankings. We're also going to take a look at that free float and free float value. We're going to get into some of the weekly news that did come out that definitely had some impacts on the prices for these different companies. And the price of Bitcoin, of course, plays a significant role. It did hit an all-time high, up around 124,000 this week, and we saw it retrace a little bit on Thursday and Friday, and it's sitting around 117,000 or so. Now, with that, some of these companies did end up closing Friday in the red. However, the weekly looks pretty positive for most of these companies. One company that specifically stands out on the weekly is Terawulf. We'll get into what caused that price movement up in just a little bit. Also, we're going to take a look at the overall sector and compare that against the price of Bitcoin and the company's strategy on the weekly and the monthly. So, all that said, let's get right into it. All right, and jumping right into it, we're going to start with the far left column, and that is going to be each of these stocks' ticker symbols. You can see there are quite a bit that are highlighted yellow, and that's because they did change short rankings compared to just a week ago. Mara did jump up in the rankings past BitDR, and CleanSpark jumped up past Riot. And then we had some movement between Core, CIFR, and HUT8. The bottom grouping really didn't move. And moving on past that, you can see the price for the stock on August 8th compared to August 15th. And if it closed in the positive on August 15th, it would be green. And red, of course, means it did end up closing in the negative for just that day. We'll talk about the weekly in just a minute, but before we do, let's move over onto max pain. You can see here that all of the companies that have the max pain that has that red coloring means that the current price of the stock is above the max pain amount, and market makers would like to see that getting pushed back down so that they are more in the money. And for the weekly, taking a look at the percentages, let's start with that first one. The top most shorted company actually had the highest movement, and that is Terawulf. It didn't move because of any form of a short squeeze, but it moved because of their announcement. Major announcement in terms of an HPC AI deal. We'll get into that in just a little bit, but it did end up closing 78.3% in the green on the weekly. The next large movement up for the weekly on these companies is going to be HUT8. They had a 19.9% increase on their share price. And then we did have a couple of laggers. If you want to look at the bottom two, you're going to see that FUFU was the worst in terms of performance on the week at a negative 4.8%, and CANG also finished low around 3.4 in the negative on percentage for the weekly. Now, moving over into share short, short value, and short percent, the companies that had an increase on their short percentage comparing Friday and Thursday trading periods, those are going to have a green filled cell. And then the ones that actually remain flat on the day are not going to have any color at all. And the ones in red means that the short interest actually decreased for these companies on that specific day. We'll get into the weekly short percentage in just a minute. But moving on past that, you can see the free float and free float value. We did have some movement in terms of the overall number of shares, and that can impact the share price of these companies. And taking a look at the top free float change, this is going to be the companies that had a share increase on the weekly. You're going to see the number one company being Hive with 27,880,000 shares getting added to the float. Of course, they are trying to increase their overall hash rate. So they're going to do that by utilizing some shareholder equity. And then looking on past them, another company that had a pretty high share movement is going to be Core Scientific. They had an additional 26,710,000 shares getting added to the float. And you can see a couple of companies that actually had a reduction in their free float numbers. And the one with the highest amount of reduction was actually IREN with a negative 12,130 shares being reduced. And this is all based on some Ortex estimated data. So a lot of this is also from the different press releases. So when a company does put out their earnings, they will list their latest share count. or if you have any movement in terms of top ownership, a lot of times you will get some share count updates for that as well. So moving on past that, let's look at this weekly percent change. Look, and this is going to be for that short interest. You're going to see the company that had the highest increase on short interest was actually Mara with a 4.51% increase on the weekly for that short percent. And you can see they did jump up to number 2 for the week on these stocks. Now, they did announce some convertible note offerings. They're doing that to raise additional revenue for various operational activities. But anytime that you do that, you are allowing these financial companies to be able to hedge their long position. This is a committed long position where they will be able to get these promissory notes at a later date. So, in the time being, they can go ahead and hedge their bets by shorting the company, and that allows them to make money on the volatility up until they're able to actually exercise that share price. So, I just want to point that out. Another company that had a pretty good increase on short interest would be Terawulf. They had a 2.71% increase. In terms of some of the negatives or a reduction on short percent, the number one reduction is actually BitDR with a negative 2.18%. So they did have a nice drop there for them. And it's with Mara jumping up by short percent and BitDR dropping down. We did have those two actually swap places on this short score rankings. So outside of that, the majority was pretty close to even. I mean, there were a couple other ones that are around 1 and maybe even 2%, but we'll move on past that. Before we move in and look at the overall sector and do some comparisons with Bitcoin and also with MicroStrategy, I wanted to go ahead and talk about some of the news that did come out this past week. So we'll start with the top of the list with Terawulf. So starting with the top news for them, they announced a $3.7 billion in contracted revenues and a 200 plus megawatt 10-year deal with FluidStack. So they did get a partnership announced and a significant amount of run rate here on revenue. And on top of that, another exciting part of this press release was the fact that Google is going to be backstopping $1.8 billion for FluidStack's obligations to Terawulf. And they're also going to be getting an 8% equity stake in Terawulf. So Google is actually investing pretty heavily here with Terawulf and with their partner FluidStack. Now, another news that actually came out the same day was that they do have a ground lease at a Cayuga site. Hopefully, I'm saying that right. If I'm not, correct me in the comments. And this is to expand their HPC footprint. And it is a 400 megawatt digital infrastructure capacity opportunity. So, again, two really good news articles showing that these Bitcoin mining companies actually can dip their toes into the HPC AI, and they are starting to get some exposure from some of the top players in the sector. Now, the next company I want to talk about is going to be Mara. They will be acquiring a 64% stake in Exion. If I'm saying that correctly, that is an HPC company. So they are going to be making that pivot and going in a parallel path between Bitcoin mining and HPC. Now, this company is a subsidiary of EDF, and Mara would be investing approximately $168 million in cash for this acquisition. So, pretty cool here to see another Bitcoin mining stock company actually jumping in with the HPC side. So, a lot of these companies have a pretty significant amount of power infrastructure. So, they have the optionality of either choosing to go full Bitcoin, pivoting completely out and going to HPC, or even doing some form of a hybrid where they have various sites set up with HPC and others set up with Bitcoin mining. We even see some companies such as CIFR that actually can do a hybrid data center where part of it is Bitcoin mining and then the other portion is for these HPC clusters. So, pretty cool to see all of these Bitcoin mining companies at least looking into the HPC AI, but not all of them have actually taken a first step and announced some movement in it. They've only just mentioned it as potential in the future, and that company would be CleanSpark. Their big announcement was that they let go of their CEO, Zach Bradford, and he has been replaced by Matthew Schultz. So that was pretty shocking news that came out. A lot of people were kind of confused and curious as to why Zach did step down. Now, it was put out in the press release that he is going to be stepping down to focus a little bit more time on his family. I'm not sure if there was anything else that was involved. If you look at the initial separation package when he was first employed and compare that against the actual severance package that he got, it did look to be a little bit more favorable. So that could mean that they needed to incentivize him to step down. So interesting turn of events. Still waiting to see exactly how Matthew is going to steer the ship, if you will. Will he stay to pure play Bitcoin mining, or will he be open minded and take a look at the HPC AI side? So I think it's going to be interesting. Another thing about these Bitcoin mining companies is they are very well versed in the power sector. They obviously know how to negotiate different utility rates with these different power companies. So that's just as important when you start talking about HPC AI. So just kind of want to point that out a little bit. And jumping down the list, actually quite a bit down is going to be BTBT. They actually had their earnings come out. They generated $25.7 million in revenue. They had 14.9 net income with an earnings per share at 7 cents. And this was basic non-diluted. And they had a total of 181.2 million in cash and cash equivalents. And then as of August 11th, they actually shared with us that they had 121,076 Ethereum tokens, and that had an approximate value of $511.5 million. So they had a significant increase in their overall earnings. And that's because they did decide to start unwinding some of their Bitcoin mining operations. And part of that is actually by selling all their Bitcoin. So they sold their Bitcoin and converted it over into Ethereum. And Ethereum did end up running a pretty significant amount, just like Bitcoin did, but it had a much larger impact. So between those, and I think there's also an open ATM for BTBT, and then they did have the white fiber IPO kind of spin off a little bit. All of those things kind of allowed BTBT to start purchasing more Ethereum. Now, when I mentioned them winding down operations, they plan on sunsetting their Bitcoin mining operations. So they will continue to mining at different sites as long as the margins are profitable. And as these machines come offline, they will not be buying new ones and replacing them. So that's going to be how they kind of wind down operations. I didn't hear about them with any plans to do any significant sales of their current units, but instead just to continue running them as is. So interesting for BTBT. And of course, they will take all of that Bitcoin that they mine, I'm assuming, and sell it and convert it over into Ethereum right away. So we'll have to continue watching this company and see if their Ethereum ownership continues to increase. Now, the next company that had just a small news update was IREN, and their announcement was just that they're going to have their earnings come out on August 28th. So be on the lookout for that, and this is going to be their full year. That's why there's a little bit of delay on them. This wasn't just a quarterly earnings update, but a yearly earnings update. And outside of them, the next is going to be Canaan. They had their earnings come out, and they had $100.2 million, which exceeded their guidance, and they had $28.1 million from just their Bitcoin mining operations. So a lot of the rest of the revenue that was generated was from the selling of their miners. And speaking of sales, the total computing power sold over the past year was 6.4 million terahash. So pretty exciting there for Canaan in terms of the amount of revenue they generated, but they did post a net loss of 3 cents a share. So it was kind of bittersweet. They did have some nice revenue. So looking at their overall Bitcoin mining cost of operations and the SG&A costs, they ended up posting a negative 3 cent loss. The next company I want to talk about is going to be Bitfarms. They had a few updates, the first of which was their earnings. They posted a revenue of 78 million. That is up 87% year over year. Their gross mining margin was at 45%, and as of August 8th, they had already purchased 4.9 million shares, as they did announce earlier on this year that they were starting a share buyback program. So it is good to see that the company is starting to utilize that buyback program and reduce their share count. The next thing I want to talk about is going to be their plans to add additional exahash. So they're currently sitting at 17.7 exahash and has an efficiency of 17 joules per terahash. And that is inclusive of their plans to shut down the Argentina site. So they didn't see favorable margins, and there was some other uncertainty and issues that did pop up at the Argentina site. So they did decide to go ahead and shut down operations. So a lot of those miners were at a worse efficiency number. So by shutting down operations there, they ended up with a much better efficiency overall for their fleet. Now, a couple other things to point out, they did post a net loss of 29 million or a negative 5 cents on their basic earnings per share. And another thing was that they had 85 million in cash and approximately 145 million in unencumbered Bitcoin. So between the cash and Bitcoin, pretty good amount of overall cash and cash equivalents. And then one other news article that did come out for Bitfarms was their July Bitcoin mining update. I just wanted to share just two or three items from that mining update. The first of which is their current exahash operations, and it's at 22.3. And total number of Bitcoins they mined in the month was 282. And overall HODL, their treasury of Bitcoin is sitting at 1,667. I got three more companies to share updates for, but they shouldn't take nearly as long as some of these other ones. The next company is going to be Hive, and they posted their earnings. They had revenue at 45.6 million, and of that 45.6, they had 4.8 million dollars coming in from their HPC side of their business at this buzz. And of that 45.6 million, 4.8 million came from the Buzz HPC side of their revenue stream. And they did have a net income of 35 million. So those are some of the good highlights for Hive. And if you want to go into detail on that, you can either take a look at their quarterly earnings, which should be posted on the SEC Edgar site, or you can take a look at their press release and see some of their additional operational updates. Now, the next company is going to be BitFuFu, and their actual quarterly earnings came out as well, and they posted $115.4 million in revenue. Net income came in at 47.1, and they had an earnings per share of 29 cents. So pretty good stuff there for BitFuFu. Now moving down into the last company I want to talk about in terms of news, and that is going to be Cango. Cango mentioned that they were acquiring 50 megawatts of a Bitcoin mining facility in the state of Georgia, and they did this with a total cash offering, if you will, of 19.5 million. So pretty cool here to see them continue to expand their footprint here in the United States. But moving on from the sector news and jumping back down into the overall Bitcoin mining sector, let's take a look at the short rankings for the week and the month. You're going to start with the increase in short percent, and that was a 0.64%. So it was an increase on the weekly here for the sector, and you can see the number of shares being shorted did increase by 37 million, and the overall free float value did grow by 7.7 million, or $2,179,000,000. So the overall sector, like I mentioned, we saw it on the weekly for each individual company, and the overall sector saw a pretty positive bounce, if you will, on the weekly. And take a look at a monthly for the sector, you're going to see that they had a plus 0.03 increase. So the overall short percent did increase on the month, and it increased by 28 million shares. And you can see that looking at the last month, the overall sector is still down by 4.96% or $1,587,000,000. So just want to point that out. The weekly does look good, but there's still room to run if you look at the overall sector in terms of valuation on the monthly. And jumping down into the weekly and monthly for the price of Bitcoin and strategy, starting with Bitcoin, you can see here that it did close Friday at $117,398, and that is an increase of about $1,005 per Bitcoin, and that is a 0.9% increase on the weekly. Now, taking a look at the monthly, you can see here that the price of Bitcoin was at $118,003. So a slight decrease on the month here for the price of Bitcoin. And then looking at the MicroStrategy company, you're going to see here that they posted a negative on the weekly and on the monthly. It did close down on the day at $366 per share. And looking at the weekly, it was $389. So it's a 6.2% decrease in value for MicroStrategy. And then on the monthly, as I mentioned, Bitcoin did close just slightly down. It was actually a 0.5%. And you can see here that on the monthly for MicroStrategy, it's down 15.5% or $56.90 per share. So, looking at the overall sector, you're going to see that it actually had a much better impact than the price of Bitcoin and MicroStrategy. I think a lot of that had to do with some of the crazy price increases we saw with companies such as Terawulf and also with HUD 8. Terawulf, of course, was their HPC AI news with this contract that just landed, specifically with Google as one of the backing partners. That did wonders for their stock, and it's been going up every day since the news did actually post. So that is a parallel path to Bitcoin. So we are seeing a little bit of a decoupling with the price of Bitcoin with the entire sector. And you're going to see this with more and more of these companies as they do pivot to HPC AI. And when those deals are announced, that's when the true decoupling does occur. Now, looking at the monthly, you're going to see that the overall sector is down by about 5%, 4.96, and the price of Bitcoin is only a 0.5%. So the overall sector is still at a dip compared to the price of Bitcoin. And then look at MicroStrategy, it has been really the poorest performer on the monthly here with a negative 15.5% compared to price of Bitcoin and the overall sector. All right, and that about wraps up for me, folks. Hope you enjoyed this quick update for the Bitcoin mining sector. If you did, consider giving the video a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and drop some comments. Let me know your thoughts about the news that came out. What do you think about some of the earnings that was also posted? And then what do you see for the overall Bitcoin mining sector compared to the price of Bitcoin for this coming week? Love to get your thoughts and feedback on that. And with all that said, hope you all have a great rest of your day. Keep calm, hatch on, and I'll see you on the next one.